Hello, and welcome to my presentation. My name is Mary Allaby, and I will be presenting on the topic Following the Trends of Social Influence Throughout History. This presentation is for History of Psych, Psych 4053. First, I'd like to go over a table of contents. Okay, so first, I will be looking at a timeline of important events that correspond with the origination of social influence as a research topic. Then I will introduce some major contributors to the field. I will show a social conformity experiment conducted by myself, mimicking the original Asch conformity experiment. So moving on from the original introduction to social influence, I want to look at certain times in history and in different countries over the years that the impact of social influence has been apparent. I will investigate this through events during the Holocaust. I will be also looking at some interesting cults and social behavior throughout them. And finally, to finish the presentation, I will investigate social influence through the current pandemic of COVID-19. And finally, there will be a conclusion. So let's jump right in. The timeline. It starts in 1773. Mesmer starts to research social influence processes. Then there's a big jump to 1886, where Burnham writes his book on suggestibility and its therapeutic applications that we'll be investigating more later. Then we have the famous Alfred Binet in 1894. He conducts experiments with intentional suggestion as opposed to unintentional suggestion on school children. We jump to the 1950s. Asch is conducting his famous social conformity experiments. 1954, Festinger investigates cult behavior. He actually joins a cult that we'll look at later and writes his book, When Prophecy Fails. And in 2020, researchers investigate COVID-19 behavior via social media and panic buying. Okay, so now it's time to introduce some major players. Number 1, we have Franz Anton Mesmer. He is a Viennese physician, and during his time, there was an extreme fascination and interest in hypnotism, which I'm sure you've all heard of, but just in case, it's a state of mental concentration that results in the patient or person being in a state of high suggestibility. The key word in the case of this presentation is high suggestibility. So, Mesmer, during this time, was investigating different ways that people shape and are shaped by other people's beliefs, attitudes, or behaviors. He was also looking at how people are shaped by different social situations. So today we would call what he's studying and investigating social influence processes, which is why Mesmer is so important, because he was one of the first people to research this topic as social psychology wasn't even a field yet. So one of Mesmer's biggest claims to fame was that he created a therapy to relieve symptoms of different illnesses, later called mesmerism. So that was what his therapy was called, and it was of course named after Mesmer himself. So Mesmer thought that people's bodies were filled with magnetic force, and if he provided an external magnetic force, this would realign their magnetic force inside of them and remove the symptoms. So as you can imagine, there was a lot of controversy around this topic, and he was also accused of stealing people's ideas and accused of plagiarizing as well. Nonetheless, while working with group sessions of mesmerism, Mesmer produced two very interesting concepts that were very important in terms of understanding social behavior. And later, psychologists coined these terms, but he was the one who really was discovering them in terms of his group therapy. The two terms were social contagion and social facilitation. So social contagion is the spread of ideas, attitudes, or behavior patterns in a group through imitation and conformity. And the second term is social facilitation, which is the strength or intensity of an act or behavior increases when performed within a social or group setting. So the picture to the left is an illustration of mesmerizing, as we call it now today, his patients in a group setting, and this is where he saw the terms come into play. We will look at these concepts later when we investigate COVID-19 and the social behaviors that have occurred in the pandemic. But for now, enjoy this very interesting skit with some very compliant members of my family.
First, allow me to introduce myself. The name's Mesmer. Franz Anton Mesmer, to be precise. I am a practicing physician. Right now around the world, there's something very popular called hypnotism, which is the process of putting someone in a state of, how should I put it? High suggestibility. Yes, that's the word. I myself am very interested in all this, of course, and am investigating it currently. A little bit about myself. I have a degree in medicine from the University of Vienna, not to brag. Anyhow, I am currently allowing my patients to come to see me for a certain type of therapy. You see, I believe there are magnets inside us all, and sometimes they get misaligned. I know, all very confusing, but I will show you my therapy. Here is a patient of mine. Just terrible symptoms, but when I lay my hands over his body, a force flows through him, putting into a crisis state. As you can see, much twitching follows and convulsions. But when this is done, the patient is relieved of his symptoms and is in good health. This therapy is making me quite popular, to be sure. It's quite the hit. And it doesn't just work on one patient, it works on many. Let's take a look at another patient by the name of Martha Smith. She was quite pleased with the result of the therapy. Now I have decided to do a group session with my patients. It seems to have a great effect, and it is in popular demand. I've thought of a rather interesting idea. I created a tub that is filled with water and magnetized metal rods. My patients enter the room and grasp the tub and enter the crisis state. This was very shocking to my other patients in the room, and they often entered the crisis state too. This is when I discovered some interesting things. When I treated people in groups, the strength of the response from my patients was enormous. These group of behaviors that I have been noticing will apparently be called social contagion and social facilitation. Anyhow, I'm pleased with my discoveries and am making quite a bit of money while doing it. Right now, I am extremely popular. Recently treated a teenage piano prodigy named Maria. She had been blind from the age of 3. And by gosh, I restored her sight through my therapy. Spectacular, really. Well, I suppose that's all.
Now on to the next major player, Hippolyte Burnham. He became a full-time hypnotherapist because he was so impressed with hypnotism. The most important and notable conclusion that Burnham made while treating his many patients was a general trait of suggestibility. Burnham noticed that while hypnotizing his patients, some of them responded quite strongly and some more weak, which he thought was extremely interesting. He described this term suggestibility by saying it was the aptitude to transform an idea into an act. He wrote more about the general trait of suggestibility in his book On Suggestions and Its Therapeutic Application that he published in 1886. So now we move on to Alfred Binet. This is a big name in the field of social psychology. So let's look at what we can thank him for in terms of social influence. Binet, interestingly enough, didn't have any formal education in psychology. However, he worked as an assistant to Charcot and his investigation of hysteria and hypnosis. Later, Binet slightly changed his tune and said that unintentional suggestion was the quote-unquote cholera of psychology. In 1894, Binet and one of his students, Henry, devised a test to look at the visual memory of school children. During these tests, Binet looked at the effect of intentional suggestion that he was able to control within his laboratory. For example, in one of his studies, Binet showed children a poster with many different elements on it. After that, he would ask the children to recall the details of the poster and ask misleading questions on purpose. For example, a question might be, "Wasn't that stamp canceled on the poster?" Now, these types of questions made many of the children have incorrect responses about the details on the poster. But, interestingly enough, if they were asked open-ended questions, most of the children remembered the details of the poster correctly. Overall, Binet's studies really emphasized the power of social conformity as a new investigated phenomena. Okay, moving on. We've got Gustave Le Bon, and he has a very interesting hairstyle, if you ask me. That was the first thing I thought of when I saw this picture. But he is a very important figure to discuss today because he wrote a very interesting book, La Psychologie des Foules, which in English translates to just the crowd, which is a large part of social influence that we'll be looking at later on in terms of the Holocaust and with COVID-19 as well. The book was said to lack scholarly depth, and today we might put it into a category such as pop psychology. But the main idea of the book was being in the midst of an enthusiastic crowd can allow a person to abandon their individuality and their rationality as well. Le Bon explained the concept that sometimes in a group, people can do heroic acts that they would never even dream of doing alone. This can be seen in, for example, warfare or in sports teams. However, on the flip side of this, people in groups can have destructive deeds and acts that they would never consider themselves capable of. So, Le Bon continued to investigate crowd phenomena by looking at behaviors of effective leaders and dangerous leaders as well, for that matter. There are 3 components, he said, to an effective leader. The leader must use simple affirmation to make their causes look simple and positive. They are repetitive. They have simple slogans that can easily be remembered. And finally, they promote social contagion. This means they have plants in the crowd that are already supporters of them and their cause, and they have them in there to sway the opinion of the crowd. This goes back to the term that Mesmer coined, that he experienced during group therapy sessions of mesmerism. Now, I put this picture of Trump down here and his famous slogan, "Make America Great Again." People have often been perplexed that he has had such a following over the years. However, when you look at it in terms of the three components above, he definitely affirmed the positive in his own causes and work and political platform. He had easy to remember slogans. They were repeatable, make America great again, and I'm sure he made sure that he had people in the crowd that were already for him and were enthusiastic. So, this is a present example of the Le Bon's definition of a effective or dangerous leader. Floyd H. Allport. Allport studied people acting individually and acting as a group. And one of the things that he discovered is that when people had to make judgments about heaviness of a weight or something like that, people avoided the extremes of the judgment compared to what they would say when they were alone. Allport is a huge contributor towards social psychology, also because he wrote the first textbook on the subject after he left Harvard. The textbook was titled simply Social Psychology. Pretty to the point. He promoted social psychology as a field that should focus on the objective and observable responses of individuals in specific social situations. So, before we move on from some of the original players in the field, I need to introduce you to Solomon Asch. Asch was born in Poland and then immigrated to the US when he was a teenager. Now, during this time, social scientists were beginning to investigate the phenomenon known as social conformity. And this was in the 1950s. And at this time, there seemed to be emerging a highly concerning component of society. It was the tendency to, quote unquote, go along with the crowd. Asch wanted to study this tendency, and this is where we get the very famous social conformity experiments. Specifically, I would like to highlight Asch's visual judgment experiment, also known as the line experiment. So in this experiment, there were a number of different visual judgments that the subjects would have to make individual decisions about. Asch's population was a number of male undergraduate participants. In this experiment, only one of the subjects was a true subject. The rest were Confederates and were given specific instructions as to what their answers should be. At first, the Confederates would answer the visual task correctly. However, in the third trial, the actors all gave the same incorrect answers to the visual tasks. So during these times, the real subject would become extremely confused and bewildered, as in the picture of the bottom of the slide in the middle participant. They would often second-guess themselves, very confused. The conclusion of the experiment was that most people fell into the category of intermediate degrees of conformity, meaning sometimes they held their own, but sometimes they would conform their answers to the visual tasks of the group, or what the group norm was. Only 25% remained completely independent and never went along with the incorrect majority. Now, if I were in this situation, I think, oh my goodness, this type of experiment does not apply to me. I would never just go along with the crowd over something trivial like choosing the right length of the line. But then again, I have never been in this situation. I wanted to try this experiment on my own, on a lower scale and with just one visual judgment task, and see how it went. I chose to do this with my own family, since they were the only population I had on hand. But fortunately for me, I have a rather large family and was able to come up with 5 willing participants in the study. Here are the results. This is my at-home version of Asch's social conformity experiment, specifically Asch's visual judgment experiment. Luckily for me, as I mentioned before, I have a very large family and was able to recruit them to do the experiment with me. I sat them all down at the table and gave them each a paper and a pen. I decided for the purpose of my at-home experiment that I would just do one visual task instead of numerous visual tasks. During this time, I was explaining to them the process of the experiment. My little brother John was a little bit skeptical, as you can see. He's on the far left. I also pulled aside my mom before the experiment because she was my confederate. This is my little brother John. He is participant 1. The next participant is actually the confederate, my mom. I made her the confederate because she already knows about Ash's social conformity experiments, so it would have been tricky to do with her. Then, participant number 3 is my little sister, Clara. Participant number 4 is my little brother, Joe. And the final participant is my little sister, Martha. So to start off the experiment, I had all participants to look at my computer screen, which had the classic lines on it. They were instructed to take a look at the line on the left and to figure out which letter corresponded with the same length of the line as on the left. After I instructed them to do this, they all thought for a little while, took a close look, and wrote down on their paper what they thought the correct answer was. Participant 1 answered C, which was the correct answer. Then participant number 2 did something interesting. She answered B, which threw everyone for a loop, as you can see. Then participant number 3 answered B as well, following what participant number 2 had said. I asked her to justify her answer, and this is her doing that right now. Then participant number 4 had a moment of extreme perplexion and confusion. He wasn't really sure what to answer now. Participant number 5 answered the correct answer, which was the letter C, so she stood strong. At the very end of the experiment, I did a debriefing, which is important to do in any experiment that you conduct. I basically explained to them the whole point of the experiment, which my little brother John thought was comical, and I explained to them the constructs of social conformity and how only 25% in Ash's original experiment remained completely independent and never went along with the incorrect majority. So for just a moment, even though this experiment was conducted from the safety of my own home, I want you to pause the video and take a guess as to what I didn't do in terms of ethical considerations in my experiment. So write down all of your ideas and then come back to the video. All right, so you're back. And if you said informed consent, you were correct. Informed consent was lengthily discussed as one of the greatest criticisms of Milgram's obedience studies, which also looked at social conformity and how far someone might go to fit into a role and to fit into a crowd. But we're going to investigate that more later. So now I want to move on from our original discussion on the pivotal players as we begin to look at social influence. And now I would like to look at social influence at work, around the world, in different countries and moving through history towards the present time. One topic that has been considerably perplexing to many people who came after World War II, or were in World War II for that matter, was Nazi behavior, and how seemingly ordinary people could have committed such horrific acts during the Holocaust. So many historical scholars and current day scholars have researched how could this have really happened. There are several different arguments as to how normal people could have been a part of the Holocaust and done horrible acts. So one of the suggestions / arguments was made by Neitzel and Weltzer, and it's the idea of war as work. Their argument here is that war itself, and in this case, World War II, creates a worldview and different patterns of behavior that may be different than an individual person's prior patterns of behavior. They say that this is what makes the extreme violence that we see in wars possible. Violence and destruction and horrible acts are simply needed by the already imposed customs of war. Neitzel and Weltzer say that the frame of reference, as they call it, war as work, makes individuals behave abnormally in a specific social situation. So, as we know, this goes back to the discussion before on Le Bon's The Crowd, when he discussed that there is a certain component of an enthusiastic crowd that allows individuals to act heroically and slightly out of individual character. In the case of regular German soldiers, Le Bon might agree and say that the horrible and grotesque acts can come from the crowd mentality and a loss of sense of individuality and rationality. So, one of the reasons that the Holocaust is so hard for historians to get their mind around is because that event is so different from every other mass killing that has occurred in history. So, why is it so different? So again, I want you to keep that paper out, and I want you to pause the video, and I just want you to jot down for a couple minutes what you think would make the Holocaust different compared to other mass killings. Okay, so you're back, and I hope you jotted down some ideas. To answer this question, and you might have come up with some other different answers, but during my research, I found that the Holocaust is a different kind of mass killing because it was extremely controlled and systematic in the way that it was conducted. And finally, another reason was the number of men that actually committed and were able to go through with face-to-face killing was extremely high. There was a theory in the 1960s coined by British psychologists that introduced the term the Nazi mind. The term was based on the assumption there must have been some sort of psychological issue or an accumulation of deficiencies in the German minds that could explain why they were able to complete so many face-to-face killings and to complete the killings so systematically. Like, it wasn't impulsive, it was highly controlled and systematic. However, when Milgram came out with his obedience studies, and this was around 1963, so Stanley Milgram's experiments were highly attracted to people because they were trying to understand how this genocide could have occurred. To put this into context, I'd like to discuss one of Milgram's obedience studies and how the particular study is the beginning of understanding how normal people can do extremely uncharacteristic acts. So let's take a look. Okay, so Milgram's obedience experiment. Milgram wanted to test obedience under controlled conditions. One experiment featured a box that was labeled shock generator. A Confederate sat in a booth that was not visible to the participants, but they could still communicate with the participant of the study. So let's take a look at the illustration to the side. So T would be our participant, and they are in control of the shock generator. And they are administering shocks to L, which is the learner or the Confederate. And then E would be the experimenter, and this is the person who is telling the participant what to do. So, the participant was instructed by the experimenter to administer a shock to the Confederate every time they answered a question wrong. So the shock started low but increased in intensity. And so after a while, the Confederate even grunted in pain and complained of a heart condition. And finally, the Confederate was told, so on their script, they were told to stop making noise completely. So, when the participant administered the shock, the experimenter pressured the participant to continue. So they would say things like, you must continue. If the participant was kind of disgruntled and was thinking, oh my goodness, I'm causing this person pain, the experimenter would say, no, you have to continue. You must go on. And here is the crazy part. This was shocking to me. Nearly 2/3 of the experimenters, 2/3 of the participants continued administering the shock to the end of the experiment. 2/3. That's most of the people went all the way to the end, to where they couldn't even hear the learner or the Confederate talk anymore. Now, you can probably imagine that this study may have been psychologically distressing on the subjects or the participants after. This goes back to when I discussed above on the importance of informed consent. And this was one of Milgram's biggest criticisms. The findings in the study began to help historians and those interested as to how regular people can be coerced into doing irregular acts, even criminal acts. Okay, so moving on from Milgram's obedience studies. So now I'm going to go into the investigation of cults and look at what they tell us about social influence and group behavior. Now, this is a really interesting section to me because I think that cults are really bizarre, so I am looking forward to this section. So, Leon Festinger. Specifically, Festinger was interested in a subject that was called cognitive dissonance. And it's really funny to me to read about cognitive dissonance because I can remember when I was little, this was one of my parents' prominent terms that I heard them say all the time. And so early on in my life, like when I was 8 years old, I was constantly walking around and saying, oh my goodness, this is causing me so much cognitive dissonance. And I knew what it meant, but only like a little bit. But I liked the term and my parents said it, so I said it all the time. You know those terms that you just, or those phrases that you just catch on to in your family and everybody just says it? Well, cognitive dissonance was one of those for me. So it's funny to be studying it now on a deeper, more prominent scale. Okay, so cognitive dissonance happens in a person when they hold two or more ideas or thought processes about something, and these thought processes actually come into conflict with one another. And what happens is the person becomes aware of this conflict between the two beliefs, and it's uncomfortable, like they feel uncomfortable, and they want to relieve the feelings of conflict in their mind. So, okay, cool, but where do cults fit into all of this? Well, there was a cult in Chicago that Festinger became interested in researching. The cult believed that the world was going to be totally destroyed by huge flash flood in 1954 on a particular day, well, at midnight. But since they were part of the cult and totally devoted to this belief and to the cause, that those people would be saved by a flying saucer. But only if they were at a particular place at a particular time. So at midnight on the day in 1954. The reason I find cults so fascinating is because this whole situation to me, like when I was reading up on this, it just sounds so bizarre. The whole group of people, normal people, could believe something that elaborate. And it kind of goes back to the fact that it's hard to wrap your mind around the idea that German soldiers who were able to commit thousands and thousands of face-to-face killings and be perfectly psychologically normal, ordinary people like you and me. This is a really, really, really difficult concept to grasp. It is for me, at least. So the reason that I wanted to highlight this bizarre cult is because this is not totally out of the normal realm. We will see the power of groupthink and social influence in today's current pandemic that I'm going to talk about later. And it'll make us look not as far from these Chicago cult members as we might hope. Okay, so back to the cult. The true believers of the cult were so devoted to the cause that a lot of them left their jobs, some of them sold their homes. Festinger and his research team were so intrigued in the behavior of the group members, and I don't really blame them, to be honest, that they disguised themselves as fellow believers of the cult so that they could get a nice up close and personal researching view. That is true commitment to research, if you ask me, joining a cult and making it believable for that matter. Needless to say, on the particular day in 1954, big shocker, no flood destroyed the earth. Now, the group was, of course, devastated and confused. I mean, if you put your whole life and all of your beliefs were in this one thing and it just didn't happen, you would be pretty devastated too. The main group leader just sat there and he just cried. But soon, something very interesting happened. He said that he heard a message from God. And the message was that because they had quit their jobs, sold their homes, and were so committed, so faithful to the cause, he had called off the flood. So that was kind of their reward. And with this new information, the followers were overjoyed. And they just went on with their lives. And they actually kept trying to find new followers for the cult. That's the part that I find particularly interesting. They still believed in the cult. The group leader and the whole cult, for that matter, clearly experienced severe cognitive dissonance when the disaster they wholeheartedly believed would occur just simply did not happen. However, the leader needed a way to relieve the dissonance that was occurring in his mind, hence the whole message from God. This would have severely lessened the cognitive dissonance in the minds of the followers of the cult. This is yet another example that we can see in later years of Mesmer's concept of social contagion. I kind of hope you guys are seeing a theme at this point. So more and more members of the group believing the dissonance-fixing idea made the whole quote-unquote message from God seem more credible and believable. So Festinger wrote all of his findings and experiences within the cult in a book, and he published it in 1956. And the book was titled When Prophecy Fails. And I think I'd be interested in reading that book because of my interests in cults. And this cult is particularly fascinating to me. So I'll have to see if I can find that book sometime. Okay, moving on. So, we have already looked at the Holocaust as well as cult behavior. And now I want to move on to look at social influence, but now more specifically in the modern era and in the world around us today. And there is lots going on in terms of social influence today that we need to uncover and investigate. So, I have created a little bit of a questionnaire. So it's just a couple questions, and I want you to answer as honest as you possibly can, and it's just for the purpose of priming our minds as we jump into the discussion on social behavior in COVID-19. So pause the video right now and go and take a look at that questionnaire. Fill it out. Take about 5 minutes or so. Really answer the questions as honest as possible. Come back and we'll keep going. So I hope that you filled out the questionnaire. I made the questionnaire simply for the purpose that you may partake in introspection on your own ways that you may have been socially influenced. It was kind of a way to gauge where you get your info from, where you perceived you conform to social influence. The point being, even if we believe we are empirical creatures, we are not without the potential vulnerability to groupthink and be socially influenced. So the last portion of this presentation, I will be focused on where we have seen social influence during the pandemic thus far. I would like to start by introducing the term panic buying, PB. This term is defined as the increase of buying essential goods or in excess as compared to normal buying patterns. This happens with some types of disaster, and the result is an imbalance between supply and demand having an interesting impact on the economy. People aren't exactly sure why panic buying exists because it is quite a complex and multifaceted phenomenon. However, there are important components of the phenomenon that we can digest, pick apart, and begin to understand. So component number 1, media, which we have all at our fingertips and we are so immersed in every single day. So the media had an important role in panic buying in terms of COVID-19. I remember looking at Facebook and seeing these pictures of empty supermarket shelves and looking at the comments on the posts, and people were filled with fear and anxiety about not having toilet paper for the coming days. So social media and media in general could have certainly been used as a remedial tool to control the social contagion that was going on in terms of panic buying. But instead, studies show that most of the time, social media has a severely integral component of inciting negative emotions and in us, and the sudden spread of misinformation, which resulted in the panic buying. So, social learning theory would suggest that the images and the news of other people participating in the panic buying made other people want to join in. And this, of course, makes sense looking back at groupthink and social contagion that we've been discussing during this presentation. What resulted in the phenomenon is, instead of being rational in buying only what one family might need for toilet paper or cleaning supplies or yeast to make bread, there was an extreme tendency to hoard, which we can hypothesize has to do with the ability of crowd tendency, as discussed by Le Bon, to lose their sense of rationality and to conform to the behavioral patterns of a group that is making the same decisions. So let's take a look at the phenomenon up close as reported by yours truly and see if this looks at all familiar to what we experience in our very own corner of the world, New Brunswick, only a few months ago.
Hello, and welcome to Fox Hill News, the news show that keeps you up to date and in the know. I'm Mary Albee, your local and favorite news anchor. Wow, has this been a week or what? With COVID-19 on the prowl and spreading quickly, we have seen something that I never thought I would see in my entire life. A fight for toilet paper. Yes, you heard me right, ladies and gentlemen. Let's take a look at what is happening at the local supermarket. And yes, even the dogs are in a scramble. Darwin's theory really shines through here. It's truly the survival of the fittest. You heard it here first, folks. And not only toilet paper, no! Cleaning supplies, yeast, and our coveted canned goods. Yes, say goodbye to your favorite tomato soup. Baked beans, you will not be finding those in the store right now. A travesty. Well, folks, that's the news. I'm Mary Albee, your local and favorite news anchor. This has been Fox Hill News.
Okay, so let's move on from panic buying and further investigate the power of online influence. So, social media. When COVID-19 was just beginning, there was something introduced that was called NPIs, and these are non-pharmaceutical interventions. For example, some of these might include stocking up on food to limit visits to town, getting some medical supplies, and also avoiding traveling, like to areas with more infection than the area that you live in. However, when the pandemic started, NPIs were being suggested, or so that's what studies say they were being suggested. However, the media was too crowded with misinformation about the virus, and this resulted in a lot of people not accurately assessing the realness of the threat of COVID-19. And this happened a lot in our small corner of the world. I still remember when I first learned about the coronavirus, I thought, no, this is something very far away from me. This is not going to come to our corner of the world. This is one of those things that I can just put in the back of my mind and I'll see it from afar, which I realize is a really naive way of thinking. And this is what happened with other people too. So this failed assessment of the virus was what many people processed in the beginning, and this was amplified due to groupthink that occurred on social media. Many people on social media can actually be aware of some facts and empirical research regarding the virus, but it doesn't necessarily matter because what is actually psychologically internalized by a group comes from group rationality, not coming from one person, comes from the group, which at times, as we saw in the investigation of cults previously in the presentation, can be very misleading and full of misinformation. One of the worst parts of all this is most of this social influence goes unnoticed by the individual because the influence of groupthink is so powerful, which is why I believe it's really important to analyze and pinpoint where you're getting your main information from and your facts from. And that was one of the reasons why I got you, my audience of this presentation, to fill out that questionnaire to make yourself aware and do some introspection on where you might be being influenced socially without maybe even being aware. So it's extremely easy to fall into an over-reliance on shared information, and even easier to conform to the norms of media and in social circles you are a part of. I myself readily confess that I fall into groupthink all the time. It's so easy to do. One particular moment that I would like to discuss to finish off this presentation is when some regulations first came into effect in the USA. And the regulations were relating to preventing the spread of COVID-19. Now, I remember reading about the great uproar and backlash that came with these mandatory regulations. This particular group, characterized by noncompliance, became a group norm in the States and were associated with the social identity that the government had no right to take away people's freedom to come together, to travel, to work, and to not wear a mask if they so choose. This social identity, defined by noncompliance, shared the belief that their own freedom had to come before controlling a deadly disease. In this, we see the power of social influence at play here today in the midst of this pandemic. So I want to leave you with a discussion question to keep you thinking about social influence in your own life. So again, I want you to pause the video quickly, jot down your ideas, and then come back in 1 or 2 minutes. So the question is, in your own experience in school, work, childhood, relationships, where have you seen social influence at work? So go ahead and pause the video. Okay, perfect. So you're back. So that is the end of my presentation. And if you have any questions at all, or even comments, or anything you'd like to say, or anything you'd like to disagree with me on, doesn't matter. Please contact me. My email is below on the slide, malaby@unb.ca. I would love to hear from you and hear your comments. And finally, here is my reference slide. So thank you very much for your time, and thank you very much for listening. I hope that this presentation was entertaining and informative and provided insight into the importance of social psychology and social influence, not only in history, but today in the world around us right now.